Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old Fourth Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
And hello, checking in again from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Working the campaign trail with my good friend Mal Hyman, running for the 7th Congressional District here in South Carolina, where I can tell you, hanging out and meeting with people in Myrtle Beach yesterday, not one person, not one, brought up John Kelly audio, the New York Times expose, Michael Schmidt releasing this yesterday with audio to back it up. This isn't, I heard somebody talk to John Kelly and John Kelly said this wasn't anecdotal information. This was John Kelly on the record. I say that nobody was talking about it because I'm not sure it's going to matter at this point. Honest to goodness, I think everyone knows who Donald Trump is. Those who are going to fervently vote for him, they know who he is. They know he has fascistic tendencies. They don't care. For some reason, there is this baked-in mindset with a percentage of American voters that they're actually okay with this. There are people who have gone on the record. You see Jordan Klepper on The Daily Show all the time talk to Trump voters, and you'll hear a Trump voter say, yeah, I think we could use a dictator for a little while. Alarmingly, that comes out of the mouths of people who have every bit as much right to vote as you or I. And I'm not sure what the solution is. Outside of swarming the polls through early voting and election day to ensure that we don't have a margin of error victory or that there's any question who won what state and that there is an honest-to-goodness rebuke of the MAGA movement and Donald Trump, the head of that, the head of that snake. And that there is some sort of restoration. I don't even know when you would go back chronologically to find a point in time where you would say, take me back to that Republican Party. It may go well back into the 1980s when a Tip O'Neill and a Ronald Reagan could agreeably disagree and come to some sort of bipartisan solution on something of magnitude. Back to an era when there could be legislation, reforms made. I definitely know that you have to go back before the advent, the uprising of a Rush Limbaugh, the Newt Gingrich era, Frank Luntz, the wordsmith, maybe all three of those coming up in the late 80s, early 90s, really changing the tone and the rhetoric in American discourse. But Michael Schmidt at the New York Times, I'm going to talk about this because this, I don't know, I feel like I'm talking to an insider's club here. Like, we're all alarmed by this stuff. We're actually not alarmed by it. We're not surprised by it, very unsurprised by it. But I guess we're all surprised. And this is the conversation on the street here in South Carolina. How is this election even this close? How are we getting polls that tell us that Donald Trump is surging, that Kamala Harris is in trouble, and that the swing states are still very much up for grabs? I mean, I have my theories on that. I have my theories on these batches of right-wing leaning polls coming out, sort of ginning up some enthusiasm on the side that backs Donald Trump to be president of this country again. I also happen to think that there is 1.5%, 2%, maybe 2.5% of voters who are brand new registered voters who don't show up in polls because they're not likely voters. You can't be a likely voter if you haven't voted before. And while they are registered voters, they're not showing up on anyone's call lists because they're newly registered voters within the last 60 days, 90 days tops. So I don't think we're getting a true snapshot of what the American voter looks like in any poll. And, I know that there are folks who do, fantastic work working on the polling and averaging them out. Nate Silver comes to mind, Real Clear Politics. I just don't think that there is a good enough snapshot to tell us. It's just one of those things where you have to ignore those things as much as is possible and hit the streets. Go out there and campaign and push your message as if you are behind. And let the chips fall where they may on Election Day. Michael Schmidt reporting from the New York Times. I'll have this in the show notes at ronshowatl.com. A few top officials spent more time behind closed doors in the White House with President Donald J. Trump than John F. Kelly, the former Marine general who was his longest-serving chief of staff. Schmidt writes, with Election Day looming, Mr. Kelly, deeply bothered by Mr. Trump's recent comments about employing the military against his domestic opponents, agreed to 3 on-the-record recorded discussions with a reporter for the New York Times about the former president, providing some of the most wide-ranging comments yet about Mr. Trump's fitness and character. Kelly was Homeland Security Secretary under Trump before moving to the White House in July 2017. He worked to carry out Trump's agenda for nearly a year and a half. It was a tumultuous period in which he drew internal criticism over his own performance and grew disenchanted and distressed by conduct on the part of the president that he considered at times to be inappropriate and reflecting no understanding of the Constitution. Schmidt writes, in the interviews, Mr. Kelly expanded on his previously expressed concerns and stressed that voters, in his view, should consider fitness and character when selecting a president, even more than a candidate's stances on the issues. We heard a lot of that from the likes of Liz Cheney on the campaign trail, literally on the trail with Vice President Kamala Harris. We're hearing that from former Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan, former Lieutenant Governor of the state of Georgia. I guess he's still a current Republican. He has this vision of a new Republican Party. And I can't wait to have him on the show sometime. And trust me, I chase him down. I'm trying to get that interview because I want to know at what point in time after this Trump era is over, or will it ever be, is the Republican Party going to self-evaluate, realize that the rhetoric filled with division, filled with misinformation, the willful disinforming of a voting base through a media entity that exists and sprung up in the advent of the Nixon presidency and the Southern strategy and the Fairness Doctrine, talk radio, Fox News, which spawned OANN and Newsmax, even further radicalizing the message. Will the Republican Party understand that that willful misinformation, that disinforming of a huge chunk of the electorate is what wrought us Donald Trump? Because it's one thing to misinform easily duped voting blocks. Donald Trump was also easily duped for decades. And we've seen he ain't a bright guy. We don't get to see what the Wharton School of Business graded him at. He literally has threatened to sue them for releasing transcripts. We don't get to see that he ain't a bright guy, but we can see with our own eyes and hear with our own ears. He's not a smart man. Easily duped. Easily. He's still running around talking about Haitian people, Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, eating geese now. He's moved on from the cats and dogs and shrugged it off as well, I heard. So if he can be easily duped by a story he heard from other people that turns out not to be true and months later clings to it, you best damn well believe he can be someone who listens to Michael Savage on talk radio or watches Fox and Friends every morning, if not on it, and be easily duped by their willful disinformation. Oops. You misinformed a billionaire who had the audacity and the temerity and the strings to pull to seek the highest office in the land, and damn if he didn't get it. There's a lot of danger in that. An awful lot of danger in that. We have the audio. Going to share some of that audio. Here is John Kelly speaking to Donald Trump and his belief that Donald Trump is a fascist to the core.
What do you think? Do you think he's a fascist?
Well, I'm looking at the definition of fascism. It's a far-right, authoritarian, ultranationalist political ideology and movement characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, belief in a natural social hierarchy. So certainly, in my experience, those are the kind of things that he thinks would work better in terms of running America. Again, back to this issue of democracy is complicated, messy to operate. Probably the worst kind of government there is, except for all the other ones. I think Churchill once said that. And again, our Constitution, our founders built in to the Constitution and to the way our government operates, built in a lot of checks and balances, and didn't design the government to be streamlined and whatnot. So, but certainly the former president is in the far right area. He's certainly an authoritarian. Admires people who are dictators. Yeah. He has said that. So he certainly falls into the general definition of fascist, for sure.
If you're going to listen to the rest of this audio hoping that you're going to hear an endorsement of Kamala Harris from the former chief of staff, you're not going to get that. You're not going to get that. I mean, there are two viable options. The former chief of staff knows that, but does not endorse Kamala Harris. And that's fine. Why expect that, I guess. But you're going to hear plenty of warning as to why Donald Trump lacks fitness, moral fortitude, and apparently scares the ever-loving out of John Kelly because of his dictatorial tendencies were he to become president of the United States.
If he was left to his own devices, would he be a dictator if he didn't have people around him?
Oh, I think he'd love to be. I think he'd love to be just like he was in business. He could tell people to do things and they would do it, and not really bother too much about whether what the legalities were and whatnot.
So in this article, Schmidt writes, when Mr. Kelly left the White House in 2019, he decided he would speak out on the record only if Donald Trump said something that he found deeply troubling or involved him and was wildly inaccurate. Trump's recent comments about using the military against what he called the, quote, enemy within were so dangerous, he said, that's why he felt he had to speak out.
And I think this issue of using the military to go after American citizens is one of those things I think is a very, very bad thing. Even to say it for political purposes to get elected, I think it's a very, very bad thing, let alone actually doing it.
So you're saying when you saw him say that recently, and as he said on the campaign trail, that was something that really concerned you to the point that you thought, as you sat there trying to figure out what to do, you thought maybe it's worth answering some questions about this.
Yeah, it is. And I go back to George Washington and how he set up, before there was an America, how he set it up so that the military would stay out of, would not be used in the United States or domestically, and that the way forward was for military officers not to be involved in politics. And again, unless you're someone like me or Mattis or people like that retired from the military or left the military, like Mark Esper or Mike Pompeo, and then go into a political job, whether it's elected or assigned by the White House, it's a little bit different because you're then involved in it. But for the most part, and that's why I'm so hesitant to talk. It's certainly never to tell or recommend to an American who they should vote for, because now that I'm out of the political job, I'm back to being pretty much a retired military officer who should not get too involved in this kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, I until the former president started talking about this, and this goes back to when I was in the White House, for that matter, DHS, I was, originally the conversation would be, Mr. President, that's outside your authority, or, that's a routine use. You really don't want to do that inside the United States. But now that he's talking about it as "I'm going to do it," is again, it's disturbing.
We have more of this conversation with the New York Times and with former Trump Chief of Staff John Kelly, who has finally now decided to go on the record after Trump has crossed a line that John Kelly set for himself to stay quiet on until Trump crossed that line. We do have more of that audio. We will dive into more of that. We'll also speak a little bit about Kamala Harris's town hall later in the show on CNN last night when the Ron Show returns on America One Radio and Progressive Voices via TuneIn. I will say this, hitting the road and working the campaign trail and getting to meet folks here in South Carolina, I have probably grown my audience by at least like 6 or 7 people who now follow the Ron Show on their preferred podcast platform. And you can too. If you listen at America One Radio or Progressive Voices via TuneIn, that's great. I'm there 5 days a week, 9 to 10 a.m., 5 to 6 p.m. weekdays on America One Radio, 11 p.m. to midnight on Progressive Voices, and on the weekends as well. I think at like 10 a.m. Saturday and Sunday. But you can listen when you want, on your time, on your preferred podcast platform. And we're on all the major ones. I thought we were on Pandora yesterday, and lo and behold, we're on Pandora. How about that? iHeartRadio, Odyssey, on those apps as well. Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We're on all the major podcast platforms. Very, very happy to hear that. I have people ask me all the time, do you know how many people listen to your podcast? I'm not going on all of those platforms to look at those numbers. When I start having advertisers come to me with huge gobs of money, that's when I'll know we've hit critical mass. Anyway, grateful to have the airtime on Progressive Voices and America One Radio, but the podcast version, the podcast route, that's an easy way to go as well to work with your schedule. As I mentioned, I am here in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, on the campaign trail, working with my good friend Mal Hyman, who's running for Congress here in South Carolina's 7th Congressional District. It is graded an R+11 district, meaning there is, in a general ballot sense, an 11-point gap between Republican and Democrat. I will say this. We were hanging out last night, at a meet and greet for Mal at Tidal Creek Brew House in Market Common, of the old Air Force Base here in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, that's been re-envisioned. And we met with voters who were Republican, who were not there to meet Mal Hyman, but they were there in the same general area, but overheard his speech. He gave a statement, and I'll give you some of that here in a little bit. And we're sort of, I don't know, I call it try-curious. Like they want to try maybe voting for a Democrat. And met several in that batch of folks who were just kind of in the periphery, but not there for the rally or the meet and greet, and came away liking the guy, impressed with him, and like to a man, to a woman, to them all, were all dissatisfied with Donald Trump atop the ticket of their preferred party, which is where his former chief of staff, John Kelly, finds himself. Back to the New York Times bombshell. Mike Schmidt reports that John Kelly believed Trump stood alone in his lack of understanding of history and the Constitution.
I mean, is he the biggest threat to the country that you've seen in your life out of all the threats, like post 9/11, all these different things?
Well, I think he's certainly the only president that has all but rejected what America is all about and what makes America America in terms of our Constitution, in terms of our values, the way we look at everything, to include family and government. And he's certainly the only president that I know of that was certainly in my lifetime that was like that.
He goes a little bit further, saying that Trump puts personal loyalty above the Constitution. Well, we know this. I mean, this is not news to us. And
did the former president appreciate the Constitution? Did he appreciate any of these things?
No. It was fascinating. I mean, he doesn't know a lot about, American history, and certainly as a farmer executive in his civilian world, I guess you can be a dictator because you can fire people pretty easily, and the only thing theoretically that you have to follow is the law. But then again, an awful lot of people break the law and expect subordinates to break the law.
Yeah, exactly.
To circumvent the law somehow.
Right.
And that's where he was coming from.
Mm-hmm.
That was his worldview.
Did he expected the people that worked for him to break the law?
Well, when he would give, and I think I've told you this many times, when he would tell me that he wanted to do something, 100% of the time I check with the White House counsel, because oftentimes he wouldn't have the authority to do what he wanted to do. And again, that's an interesting point, because if you listen to, certainly in my study of presidents, and if you listen to presidents when they leave office, whether they write a book or do interviews, one of the things that surprises them initially was how little power they actually had, and how much they had to work with the Congress to get things done. And most of them accepted that and worked within the rules of what the Constitution dictates. It's frustrating, I'm sure. Well, I know it's frustrating for them, because their agenda that they're trying to push, and suddenly they have to go to the Congress to get money, and if the Congress is not inclined to go along with it, then it's very frustrating. But that is the law.
Except for all of his life, most of it anyway, Donald Trump has been above the law. We'll pick up on that point when the Ron Show returns.
Broadcasting 5 days a week to make common sense common again. This is The Ron Show on America One Radio.
So we're pouring over the audio from the New York Times, bombshell audio from former Trump Chief of Staff John Kelly, who has finally decided Trump has crossed a red line on rhetoric where he spoke in recent weeks of using the U.S. military or National Guard against, quote, the enemy within. He's talking about you and me. He's talking about anybody who does not agree with Donald Trump, who would stand in the way of what Donald Trump would singularly want to do. The thing that frightens me most about a second Trump presidency isn't just Trump winning or Republicans controlling the White House, the executive branch. That doesn't scare me. I, on this show, had said many times, if I had to grip myself through a 4-year GOP presidency from 2024 through 2028, I could stomach a Chris Christie presidency. No pun intended. I believe we could endure a Nikki Haley presidency. The Nikki Haley presidency worries me most as a partisan, because I happen to think that Nikki Haley, and this is, well, let me finish with what I was going to say about Nikki. I think a Nikki Haley presidency might give the GOP at least the facade of being a more woman-friendly option, not on policy, but just on the front. And as we've seen, the Republican voter is swayed by facades. Donald Trump is a facade. He is a fraud. The very nature of a man who thought it would be cute to serve fries from a fast food window of a closed, for him, McDonald's, pretending to work at McDonald's, to pretend customers at that closed McDonald's, just epitomizes the fraud, the facade of a human being, of a successful human being, that Donald Trump is and always has been for almost all of his life. John Kelly was talking about the many and varied ways that Donald Trump, as president, would be frustrated by the pesky Constitution and the law getting in the way of him doing what he wanted to do. The thing that scares me most about a second Trump presidency is that in the first Trump presidency, he surrounded himself by career Republicans who, MAGA will say, well, they're just part of the swamp now that has to be drained. He surrounded himself with career Republicans who may have agreed with him on policy, but also knew what a danger he would be if unchecked. Well, they don't want to work for him anymore. You can't find many career Republicans who want to work for and with Donald Trump. But you can find a lot of lackeys and yes men and women and bootlickers who will do anything he wants them to do, whether it's legal or not. After January 6th, a lot of career Republicans said, as I'm quoting Lindsey Graham, that's it, I'm out. Lindsey Graham has since come back. There would be no checks, almost none, for Donald Trump to do as he wished, whether it jibed with the Constitution or not. More audio from John Kelly speaking to this.
And when he was confronted with the fact that he couldn't do something, did he want to do it anyway? I mean, when he was confronted with the fact that he couldn't do something legally, did he want to do it anyway?
Of course.
He would try to make the case that he did have the authority.
And fortunately, we had men and women like John Kelly who would inform him, no, Mr. President, you can't do that. Are we certain that in Donald Trump's periphery there is such a person now? The man gave a 10-minute sermon about Arnold Palmer's genitals. Did anyone on the campaign tell him, I don't think I'd bring that up? The man speaks glowingly of Viktor Orban. Nobody on his campaign says, he's kind of a dictator. It's not a good look for you, Mr. President. There are no checks. There are no balances. We are not insulated from the abject worst of Donald Trump. And we know this because we get it every day in the news cycle. I mentioned yesterday, hanging out at a brew house, talking to folks about politics. Not one person brought up the bombshell audio that I'm giving you today. I mean, it may soak in at some point in time, but we're less than 2 weeks from Election Day, and I think folks who have already voted, obviously, they're already on the record. I think folks who are going to vote, they already know who they're going to vote for. The undecided voter, to me, it's like, how are you still undecided at this point? I don't understand that. CNN had an entire town hall. I'm going to try to get some audio of that to you today. I may or may not have time. Had an entire town hall, and then after the town hall, had undecided voters who are in many ways still undecided. How you can be undecided at this point? Like at some point in time, it's like taking the keys from someone who shouldn't be driving. Maybe you just need to sit this one out if you're at this point still undecided. Speaking glowingly of dictators, back to the Mike Schmidt reporting at the New York Times. John Kelly confirmed previous reports that on more than one occasion, Donald Trump spoke positively of Adolf Hitler.
He commented more than once that, that Hitler did some good things too. And of course, if you know history, again, I think he's lacking in that. But if you know what Hitler was all about, it'd be pretty hard to make an argument that he did anything good.
So what would you say when he said to you that Hitler did a lot of good things?
Well, I tell him that. I said, first of all, you should never say that. Oh. But if you knew what Hitler was all about from the beginning to the end, everything he did was in support of his racist, fascist life, philosophy, so that nothing he did you could argue was good. It was certainly not done for the right reason. And but he would occasionally say that.
What would he say when you would lay that out to him?
He just, that'd be the end of the conversation usually.
Let's review what he said there. If you know what Hitler was all about from the beginning to the end, everything he did was in support of his racist, fascist life, the philosophy, so that nothing he did you could argue was good. It was certainly not done for the right reason. Could you not take those words, those very words, and put that into the mind of the MAGA voter? To speak that into the face of the MAGA voter and say, yeah, okay, listen, I get it. You like Trump's tax cuts, or you think Trump's tariffs are somehow going to be good for the economy, although no economist can say that. In fact, many are saying, that's recipe for a depression, not a recession, a depression. You could say, if you want, that you agree with Donald Trump's foreign policy, trying to take a tougher tack with our closest allies, or that he wants to somehow draw down our involvement in Ukraine. You could sit here and make all of these, okay, I prefer this postures. I can sit here and do several shows arguing those postures. But even if you do agree with any of his policies, I'm going to take the words that John Kelly used here. If you know what Trump was all about from the beginning to the end, everything he does in support of his racist, fascist life, you know the philosophy, so that nothing he did you could argue was good. It's certainly not done for the right reason. Any right-winger who's listening could go full-on alarmist and say, Ron's comparing him to Hitler. Not comparing him to Hitler. He's yet to, do any of the things that Hitler did to exterminate an entire subset of the human population. I'm not saying that left unchecked, that's what Donald Trump would do either. No, I'm not saying he's Hitler. I am saying that he has, as John Kelly put it about Hitler, a racist, fascist life, a philosophy, a white nationalist philosophy. He speaks to that camp all the time. The nod to that camp in choosing J.D. Vance as his nominee for vice president. The stand down and stand back message to the Proud Boys. The hands-off attitude towards Charlottesville while being willing to send in the National Guard or consider using the U.S. military against Black Lives Matter's protests. Oh, and most notably, his disinterest in calling the National Guard into duty on January 6, 2021. That's the obvious one. John Kelly has been most notable after serving for Donald Trump for telling reporters, or speaking of the off-the-record comments Donald Trump would say of disabled service members and U.S. veterans, the whole suckers and losers thing. And he validates that.
Does he have disdain for the disabled?
Well, certainly his not wanting to be seen with amputees that lost their limbs in defense of this country, fighting for every American, to him included, to protect them, but didn't want to be seen with them. That's an interesting perspective for the commander-in-chief to have.
Why didn't he want to be seen with them?
He would just say, look, it doesn't look good for me. So anyways, I don't know. I'm not a psychiatrist. If you're a psychiatrist, I guess you could take a stab at some of these questions, but I'm not.
When pressed further on that.
But he basically said to you that those who died for America on the battlefield were losers and suckers, and he said it more than once.
Yes, but he would say it would always, that something else would get him going. Oftentimes, again, McCain, he talked about, and it was like almost a recording. But the point is, anyways, he would say it at times, sometimes unexpectedly, but he never could wrap his arms around why people would serve the country in uniform. What was in it for them? That was the general theme. I think that's much more actually powerful than talking about what he said about, blues and lie. I think he just could never wrap his arms around why people would do things selflessly. What's in it for them? I think that's a much more powerful, but that's just me.
Which sort of cements the argument that anyone who campaigns against or makes the argument against voting for Donald Trump, it just validates what we say. He's not driven by serving the American people or doing for the American people. Anything he does to serve himself. The very fact that he started running for this presidential campaign as his trials were stacking up and he started envisioning guilty pleas and prison time. I mean, it's inarguable that that's why he sought to run for office. He hasn't bothered to come up with substantive policy positions and statements. He gives us concepts of plans, much like a D- student gives us concepts of a book report that D student didn't read. We know he doesn't do a whole lot of reading. And still, despite all of this, John Kelly, the former chief of staff of Donald Trump, is not going to endorse anyone. But he does kind of give you this.
I'm not recommending anything to anybody. I'm just saying, other than that, when you're looking to vote for someone, regardless, you got to look at the character and all of those kind of things, and then start looking at the individual's policies. We can always, even if you're a conservative Republican, much of what's gone on the last 3.5 years hasn't been what you've wanted to have happen to the country. But we can get by it because you might have a Republican come in the future. But if a person's character isn't at least minimally acceptable, then I think that person can do a lot more damage. Mm-hmm. We've got to. I just wish. I'll end with this. I just wish, at the end of all of this, whoever wins, that person and the leadership in the country, certainly the political leadership in Washington, to include the House and Senate, that people say, okay, let's take a breath, let's step back. This has been really, really hard. Let's try to come back together as Americans. Stop hating each other just because we have a difference of opinion on political issues. I just hope we do that somehow. I don't know if we will, though, but I hope we will. I hope whoever becomes the president will start that process. Let's become friends again.
And that's a tone that you're getting from the Kamala Harris campaign, with Liz Cheney, much to my chagrin, with Dick Cheney endorsing her, with Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan of Georgia endorsing her, and speaking, all of them, against a second Donald Trump presidency. More on show after this on America One Radio and Progressive Voices via TuneIn. Final few minutes of today's Ron Show. I want to thank you again for listening. Let's focus so much on the bombshell New York Times audio, John Kelly, former chief of staff of Donald Trump. I haven't even really had the opportunity to talk about what I'm doing in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, which I mentioned yesterday. I'm on the campaign trail with my good friend Mal Hyman, running for U.S. Congress. Here he is last night at a little meet and greet with some of his supporters, some who are maybe on the fence a little bit. We actually had folks in the periphery who were not there to listen to him or to meet him, but heard him and then came to speak to him afterwards. I think he picked up voters last night, Republican voters. Anyway, here is a snapshot of what Mal Hyman is all about.
Thank you all for coming out. Great to join. Scott did a good job organizing this. The weather's cooperating. It's a humbling, daunting task to run for office. I'm really a teacher. 50 years. Public schools, taught in a medium security men's prison, maximum security men's prison. Last 37 years, Coker University, sociology and political science. Some with my old buddy Danny Malone there, who now teaches CCU. Randy, who was singing the songs. We started organizing in Riverside, California, and our group was interested in peace and justice issues, and they were building a nuclear plant on an active earthquake fault line, and we fought them every way that we could. They buried us in the legal battle, and the last step was civil disobedience, and we got arrested together. And he's out here 45 years later. We're still working together on questions of social justice. Danny Malone will tell you what I'm like in the classroom. We've had endless discussions on social justice. You know, my speech, same thing I've said in the churches. I'd like to tell the story that every teacher in prison would share. When you talk to inmates, when did you lose hope? And they typically say at the age of 10, 11, and 12. Now, they made some bad choices, but they didn't pick their parents, their schools, their community, or their country. We made a lot of bad choices. And either we're going to truly leave no child behind, or we just keep talking about it. Either we do unto the least of these, or we just keep talking about it. I believe with Mary and Rod Edelman, who inspired Martin Luther King's Poor People's March on Washington, that all children have a right to food, health care, housing, good schools, safe streets, clean air, and clean water. We've got 10 families in this country have more wealth than half the country. They need to pay their fair share so that we have the resources to invest in opportunity and security for people.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King said it's a crime in this wealthy nation for people to work for starvation wages. And the minimum wage today is lower now than it was back then if you factor inflation. We must do better. The corporate media doesn't cover minimum wage even on Labor Day. They don't cover questions of medical care for people. I believe medical care is a human right. It's a God-given right. We need only look across the border to see what they do in Canada. They've had health care for everyone since 1971, pushed by business leaders as well as the church, and they live longer than we do. Everyone's covered, costs 2/3 as much money. Amen. We have these models out there, but a corporate-owned media doesn't share this with us, let alone what Fox is doing, which is more propaganda than news. We have the former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying that Trump is a fascist to his core. Everything sacred is on the ballot this time. We've seen what the Supreme Court did on questions of women's reproductive rights, on protecting the environment, on money in politics. All that's going to be continued with a Trump administration where they'll make more appointments in that direction. I'd say climate change is red lights flashing at a global level. Our civilization is a force of nature that threatens our security. We're reaping what we've sown. We've seen it with the hurricanes that have come through Milton and Helene. That's the new normal. We have to take this very, very seriously. The Biden-Harris team takes it seriously. They made unprecedented investments in sustainable energy. That needs to be continued. We've got an electrical grid that's still vulnerable to cyber attack. It can't bring sustainable energy from the countryside to the cities. We need to make those investments. The way you make those investments is you tax the wealthy and you spend it for public goods. I just see this as common sense for the common good. Everything sacred is on the ballot this time. We saw with January 6th what the other side thinks of the rule of law. We also saw Congress unable to convict, and we saw the courts unable to move forward, national security documents stolen, and the courts weren't able to deal with it because money and ideology clogged the courts. And now it comes down to the people, we the people, to defend the democracy that we've had here, ever-changing for 240 years. I wish it wasn't like this after 50 years of teaching. I never imagined that this would be the case, but it is. We'll all wake up on November 6th thinking about what we woulda and coulda, shoulda done. Not only is democracy on the ballot, women's rights is on the ballot, climate change is on the ballot, affordable child care, affordable education, common sense gun control, all of that is on the ballot. There's a huge difference between the political parties at this point. Look, I believe we're going to stay the land of the free and the home of the brave if we're brave enough to defend elections, brave enough to defend the Constitution, brave enough to see ourselves in others and know in our bones that we're sisters and brothers. American Olympic team marches into the stadium. There's no country that looks like America. We're a nation of many nations. E pluribus unum. Out of many, we're one. God bless America. Thank you all.
I mean, more of that, please. Could we have 434 just like him in Congress? Be nice. But we're working on the one here in South Carolina. By the way, if you are more curious about Mal Hyman, or you live in the district, or if you don't live in the district but want to throw a little good grace his way, you know what I mean. Mal Hyman, HYMAN.com. And you can get to know that guy a lot more and help his campaign out in the closing days. It may only take one or two flippable districts to get the House back in Democrats' favor. All right, show notes at RonShowATL.com. Back tomorrow, 9 to 10 a.m., 5 to 6 p.m. on America One Radio, 11 p.m. to midnight at Progressive Voices or wherever you podcast. Take care.